All right, welcome everyone who's joining us. We'll just give it another minute as I see you all coming in, which is really awesome. We're looking forward to getting started in a minute. All right, well, welcome everyone. I'm so excited to be here with you all today. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm very excited to be here with Dr. Nicole Redford and Dr. Clark Schreck to kick off the Mobilizing Alberta Climate Conversation Speaker Series. We're also celebrating UCalgary Sustainability Week and the City of Calgary's 5th Annual Climate Symposium. So there's so many great events happening this week. I really love it. I hope we can keep the momentum going. My name is Alana Dawn. I'm the Partnerships and Events Coordinator here at the Office of Sustainability and feel very fortunate to be part of the event today and learn from today's presenter, the amazing and brilliant Dr. Nicole Redford, who will discuss Indigenous and planetary health. So to get started in a good way, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising of the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Goodstoney First Nations. The City of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. Acknowledging the land is an important part of honoring Indigenous cultural practices and building healthy relationships that are respectful. We honor that truth and reconciliation is important for advancing climate justice in society and are grateful for Indigenous communities' leadership in climate action and protecting the health of the land and sharing their knowledges for building healthy relationships amongst communities and the earth. So today's session on Indigenous and planetary health is kicking off our climate conversation speaker series. I'm very honored to have Dr. Nicole Redford here today. The purpose of this series is to engage in transformative conversations on climate action, to learn from and share diverse perspectives and worldviews on climate action, to empower people to take meaningful action in their own ways and connect with the climate action community. So as I mentioned, today's session is also part of UCalgary Sustainability Week. This is happening from October 23rd to 28th. It's an opportunity to connect with sustainability leaders, engage in discussions on timely social environmental topics, and discover ways we can make a meaningful impact locally and globally. Sustainability Week 2023 centers on the theme of resilience, reciprocity, and renewal, and is guided by UCalgary's Itapito Indigenous strategy to promote cross-collaboration and inclusive learning opportunities that educate, build awareness, and understanding of sustainability from diverse perspectives and worldviews. So there's lots of amazing events happening this week. There's going to be a carnival where you can play games and learn about the United Sustainable Development Goals. Later this evening, there'll be artists talking about what ecofeminism means to them. And on Saturday, Moving Mountains is a one-day climate gathering where there'll be workshops, art, networking, and a social. So lots of great things happening this week. And as I mentioned, we're also celebrating the Calgary Climate Symposium. There's going to be many free virtual events that you can check out. And this week is all about exploring how Calgary can position itself for a low carbon future and leverage economic opportunities, how Calgary can strengthen communities to be resilient to climate change, and how we can ensure no one is left behind. So we'll put the scheduled events in the chat for that as well. But today, very thrilled again to have Dr. Nicole Redford be here with us to discuss Indigenous and planetary health. So she will give her presentation and then we'll move into a discussion with the moderator and then a Q&A, and really looking forward to engaging with all the participants and hearing your questions. You've noticed it's a webinar format today, so you won't have access to chat, but we'll be able to share important links to you through that. Please put your questions in the Q&A function when we get to that part of today's session. And now I'm very thrilled to introduce to you all Dr. Clark Schreck. He is a family physician at the South Health Campus Academic Teaching Clinic and a clinical assistant professor in the Department of Family Medicine at the University of Calgary. In his previous life as a civil environmental engineer, it informed his research and educational interests in planetary health. at intersections of nature and the built environment, and how all that comes together in active, healthy communities. So welcome, Clark, and I'll pass it on to you.
Great. Thanks, Alana Dawn. It is welcome, everybody, and thanks for taking some time in your lunch hour if you're local, or another part of your day if you're hailing in from another time zone. It is my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Nicole Redvers to this webinar. Dr. Nicole Redvers is a member of the Daninu Kwe First Nation in the Northwest Territories and has worked with Indigenous patients, scholars, and communities around the world. She is a naturopathic doctor, has a master's of public health and a doctorate of philosophy. I read a quote from Dr. Redvers that her training and education have provided a bridge between two divergent worldviews, that of the Indigenous worldview and the conventional, or the Western worldview. She is an associate professor, Western Research Chair, and director of Indigenous Planetary Health at the Schulich School of Medicine and Dentistry at Western University. She's been actively involved at regional, national, and international levels, promoting the inclusion of Indigenous perspectives in both human and planetary health research and practice. And she is the author of numerous peer-reviewed publications on these topics, as well as a book entitled The Science of the Sacred: Bridging Global Indigenous Medicine Systems and Modern Scientific Principles. The one time that I've had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Redvers in person, she just confirmed my expectation that she is a person who can bridge perspectives and find shared values among people. We hope that her presentation and the questions afterwards can encourage ongoing dialogue in the climate conversation series and beyond. I honestly feel like a giddy fanboy about to interview a rock star in planetary health, so please join me in welcoming Dr. Redvers to the mic for her presentation.
Masi Cho, thank you for that warm welcome and introduction. Really appreciate being here today with all of you. I'm just going to go ahead and share screen, so just bear with me for one moment here while I hopefully get technology working on our side. Perfect. So I'm just going to make the assumption that you can see me, that you can hear me okay, and the slide is functioning. I'm looking at a thumbs up from Clark, so it should be good to go. Well, one of the things that's really important for me, and I always start my presentations with a few key slides, as regardless of what setting I am, or even what I have stated before, I always have a responsibility to be able to root myself to my origin, my family, my community, but also set the context for how and why I speak. And where I come from, my way of being, my way of knowing, my lived experience has really been informed by tens of thousands of years of memories that are stored in my region's stories. And stories are our main methods, so to speak. And as a past clinician and now a researcher, it's important for me to be in relationship to my work, to my culture, to my community. And this self-location, this positionality, so to speak, is very purposeful in order to demonstrate respect for, but also to remain accountable to all my relations, or Salotina, as we say in my Denisuflene language. Now, I noted, of course, stories and the importance of stories. And I really like how George Kajati aptly describes this relationship by saying that the culture's vitality is literally dependent on individuals in community with the natural world. Indigenous cultures are an extension of the story of the natural community of a place and evolves according to ecological dynamics and natural relationships. Therefore, I must honor my ancestors and my elders, as anything I talk about, share about from my Indigenous way of being is not my knowledge, it's not my expertise, but it is a collective way of knowing of a group of people in my region that stretches thousands of years. Now, our Indigenous methodologies for well-being stem from a decolonized state of being that could be said to be premised on 4 R's, which are often described as respect, as relevance, as reciprocity, as responsibility, with direct underpinnings and connection, transferability to our kinship relationships with all planetary elements and beings. Now, this idea of how we formulate our relationships are rooted in an absolute framework of knowing that prizes interconnectedness as a fundamental state of being. So how do we turn this interconnected relationship to land with a capital L, into a methodology for health and well-being? Well, of course, from my perspective and from many Indigenous people's perspective, we've already had a methodology. There's been a healing method in existence for thousands of years in how to live and heal sustainably. All are based on our sacred natural laws, sometimes called first laws, original laws. In my region, we call them Dene laws, which then define our traditional protocols, which are like guidelines for how to walk in the world in a good way, which then give a framework for the modern world scholarship, healing, and even things like governance. Now, our sacred natural laws, first law, original law, in my case, Dene laws, are our traditional protocols. And therefore, our frameworks for healing are all done through a respective ceremony, which is a critical action in reciprocity. So why does this matter? And clearly our world has changed. We've went from this circular and natural worldview to a very square and synthetic worldview. And I often ask folks to take a moment to really look at this image and see how it makes your body feel inside when you look at it. So how do we get back to our origin? How do we decolonize ourselves and teach others the natural laws and protocols that allow for a more sustainable world? Because the health effects are clear. The land is a healing place, not just because of what it gives us, but what it provides us, what it gives us in relationship. And as Indigenous peoples, our relationship to Mother Earth as our mother often means that we will do anything to protect her. Yet the risk and also the actualization that's occurring in many areas in regards to the tokenization of Indigenous traditional knowledges without the consequent support of Indigenous peoples means that our land and place rights are often put well before the knowledge that can be extracted for some things like sustainability and climate change. And in fact, the consequent support of Indigenous land and place rights beneath Indigenous knowledges alone of us as peoples, in my mind, continues the marginalization of Indigenous peoples' knowledge over them as peoples and communities. Indigenous peoples right now host and live in relationship with 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity. Yet we live on only 22% of the Earth's surface. We make up about 6% of the global population right now. 6% of the global population right now are stewarding 80% of the remaining biodiversity on the planet. Yet we are still having lands being taken, being killed or jailed for defending our lands in various geopolitical contexts around the globe, and being subject to political marginalization, leading to some of the worst health inequities on the planet. And in addition, what many fail to realize is that violence against the land is often seen as violence against women, as we see so powerfully depicted in this artwork by Katie Douglas. Vanessa Gray aptly states, the land is our mother. So when we lose value for the land, people lose value for women. We are clearly in a time of change. So how can we think about solutions? And planetary health, Clark had mentioned this during the introduction. Planetary health as a terminology is a relative newcomer in the Western way of thinking and applying knowledges. And although conceptualizations of planetary health have been in and around Indigenous communities for thousands of years, it was formally defined in the English language in about the last 10, 15 years or so. And its original origins within Western applications were actually very anthropocentric or human-centric in nature. And it's still somewhat the case today. However, this is improving. And I've been one very much to push the field into dropping its anthropocentric or human-centric original framing, both from a definitional standpoint and also from a practice standpoint. So the Planetary Health Alliance was out of Harvard, but now it's just recently moved to Johns Hopkins as of November 1st. After a very recent revision to the definition, now defines planetary health as a solutions-oriented, transdisciplinary field and social movement focused on analyzing and addressing the impacts of human disruptions to Earth's natural systems on human health and on all life on Earth. Now, if we consider an Indigenous approach, and again, not to homogenize the constructs or the framing of Indigenous peoples, at a very meta level, planetary health as a field is primarily a Western construct, as Indigenous traditional knowledge systems have no clear separation between the health of the planet and the health of self, or even that of the community and ecosystem at large. So this actually means that planetary health, the meaning of planetary health, the applications of planetary health are directly rooted in community values based on their own traditional protocols for living in harmony with all that has existed for thousands of years. So when we think about planetary health, especially from an Indigenous perspective, we can think of it as being nested into an interconnected relationship with other innate and applied knowledges within the community, which then impacts the health of our communities and ecosystems at large. Now, this lens of the world, the way that we view the world, clearly affects how we see our innate hierarchy of ourselves over all other beings on the planet. And we see here the side on the left, which has most often been encompassing of how we live in our world today, this anthropocentric or human-centric approach, this ego, this I, humans being at the top of the hierarchy over all of the beings and things on Earth, comparatively to this cosmocentric or ecocentric, this eco-we approach, where humans are just one very small part of a greater system. Now, health equity considerations in both research and practice are thankfully becoming more common in our modern conversations. But what is important, as denoted here, is actually an interspecies equity approach that is seen from a place of relationship or relationality. We are all interconnected with no hierarchy between us when it comes to how the natural systems operate within the world. And I, as well as many Indigenous elders that I've had the honor to learn from, often talk about not the word equity per se, but this intergenerational approach. And here I term it intergenerational equity. Interspecies equity was highlighted on the previous slide. However, again, we also have to understand notions of intergenerational equity, which is a prime consideration for Indigenous communities. In fact, here our Haudenosaunee relatives aptly describe their seventh generation principle, which very loosely taking into consideration wisdom of knowledge and experience gained over the past 7 generations, to be able to ensure that the decisions that are made today have a positive impact, sustainable impact for the 7 generations to come. But yet, of course, we currently have really been mortgaging the health of future generations to realize economic and development gains in the present, and really looking to this consideration of what we mean when we consider terms or applications of intergenerational equity. Now, this interconnected nature that I keep describing, and even this interconnected nature generationally or intergenerationally, is also depicted by this figure here on the slide. We are unified communities due to this interconnectedness on all fields of structure and influence, but there's also a clear interrelationship with repercussions for not living in balance with the planet, as we have what's called Earth-centered jurisprudence systems. Earth-centered jurisprudence or law systems that govern both nature but also our global systems. So in essence, there's this unity of natural law, of first law, of original law. There's a unity of natural law between us and all things around us. The sun will continue to rise from the east and set in the west. The moons will continue to affect the tides. But Mother Earth will also respond to our interactions with her, which ultimately affects all other life forms. So in this vision for a healthy future, it's important to create the conditions that enable the overcoming of the dissonance, this disconnect between this idea of being in nature, going out to a park, going out in nature, this embodiment of nature that's just external to us, comparatively to being of nature, nature that embodies us. And one of the best ways I can depict this, and often something I share with clinicians and scientists and the rest of this, is when we say we're interconnected to nature, it's not just a metaphorical kind of symbolism. And I'll often ask folks, where does your water come from that comes out of your tap? In fact, I was presenting to some global health students this morning, master's students, and I said, where do you get your water from? Probably about 35 students in the class, and not one student could answer the question of where their water comes from. I've had kids answer this question, from the kitchen tap, and I said, no, before the kitchen tap, where does it come from? And here where I am right now, I'm beautiful Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, Lenape, and Shonotone territories. We have water coming from both Lake Erie and Lake Huron. So it takes on average about 3 months or so for cellular turnover in your body systems. Not all, but if we could say a general average, about 3 months for cellular turnover. So I asked then, what percent of water is your body? Around 60% or so, generally, give or take, depending on if you're female at birth or male at birth, but around 60% water. So after about 3 months, if I've been in this location here, drinking water out of Lake Huron, Lake Erie, after about 3 months or so, 60% of my body are those lakes. I'm sitting here as the embodiment of those lakes. If you're in Calgary, drinking water, I'm assuming out of the Elbow River, 60% of you becomes that river. We are all the embodiment of the rivers and lakes that we consume from. We are literally interconnected. We are that lake. It is interconnected with inside of us. So again, we are not metaphorically interconnected. We are physiologically interconnected to the land. And it's one of the reasons why Indigenous communities are such strong water protectors, because if the water is healthy, we are healthy. If the water is not healthy, we cannot be healthy. So ultimately, what we call natural or first law is the way of living on our lands handed down through countless generations. It sustains a web of relationships between the human and non-human world and forms a pattern which is life itself. And this pattern must be recreated and the law followed to sustain life. So our Indigenous traditional knowledges are directly nested within understandings of natural or first law, whose meaning again is uniquely rooted within the respective lands globally that we come from. And Elder David Kushir of the Anishinaabe Nation states that working in alliance with nature and her natural laws is the key to ensuring our survival. The reason we have climate change is because we have broken natural law. What is natural law and how can we find our balance again? The spirit in each of our beings carries moral and ethical principles of what should be the basis of our human conduct. We understand those moral principles as natural laws. Natural laws are innate to all living beings. They are invisible laws that govern all life. All living beings, including Mother Earth herself, are governed by natural law, whether they know it or not. So as we confirm and emphasize the Indigenous perspective that there is no separation between ourselves and that of the earth, with complete interconnections existing that really precludes an isolated definition, I like to reflect on the words so brilliantly described by Paula Gwen Allen, who's a Pueblo woman. And she states, "We are the land. The earth is the mind of the people, as we are the mind of the earth. The land is not really the place separate from ourselves where we act out the drama of our isolate destinies. It's not a means of survival, a setting for our affairs. It is rather a part of our being, dynamic, significant, real. It is our self." And even our names, our identities often come from this deep and fundamental understanding of interconnectedness. And I come from Dene peoples in the north. Dene, and de means flow. Ne means land. So Dene are literally flowing from the land. It's who we are within our name. We have a relationship with the land. Our very being flows from the land and the land from us. The concept of flowing from the land roots us, Dene, in our landscapes and creates the culture. And as such, the teachings about the land serve as the essence of our being. There is no separation from land, but when there is, this is when dysfunction starts to arise. So why is this important for me to state? And I often think of the words of Chief Dan George, who was chief of the Tsleil-Waututh First Nation, and he said very aptly, "Allow me to learn the ways of your book knowledge so that I may combine it with my natural knowledge and lead the way. Allow me to learn the ways of your book knowledge so that I may combine it with my natural knowledge and lead the way." Many Indigenous peoples understand that a blend of traditional knowledge and modern knowledge may be the only way forward sustainably for the planet. And I emphasize here the concept of epistemological pluralism. It's a big word, epistemological pluralism. But essentially, what epistemological pluralism is it recognizes that in any given practice context, there may be several valuable ways of knowing. And then accommodating this plurality, this diversity, can lead to more successful integrative study, solutions, and practice. And I do believe we are slowly starting to see change happen. And I believe it's because of a deep reflection of our values, our vision, and purpose of what we're trying to do here as a collective community. But I also believe it was due to diverse voices standing up for their rights and showcasing the strengths they have to offer the global community in the time of this great crisis or multiple crises and need. And it's also occurred, however, by allies standing up and stepping back to allow those diverse voices to be heard. Now, I noted before, we live within nested but interconnected levels of knowledges and applications surrounding our healthy communities and ecosystems, embodied through understandings of natural law, Indigenous knowledges, which are operationalized through our traditional protocols, leading to healthy communities and ecosystems, in essence, planetary health. The more we can continue to step back and uplift diverse knowledges, the more hope we have of getting us through these intersecting crises. And although Mother Earth is a living system that can transform and heal herself, as one of my colleagues and friends, Anne Polina, Aboriginal Australian, states, although Mother Earth is a living system that can transform and heal herself, she will be lonely without the vibrations of her human family. So the planetary health movement is gaining significant traction in and around universities, in organizations, everywhere from here in North America to Europe, even places like Africa, abroad, which is very positive, as we even see here today on some of these discussions. However, again, I always highlight that planetary health is by no means a new innovative discipline, as sometimes is still often suggested within academic circles. But it is a deeply rooted connection that all of our ancestors had to the land as a medicine place at some point within our histories. And to understand the planet and its functions is really to understand oneself in the Indigenous worldview, because of these inherent interconnections that I described, walking rivers and lakes around. So if the climate change movement, if the sustainability movement broadly is going to be successful, it will need to platform itself as being more culturally safe, critically conscious, and have a greater appreciation of currently often marginalized Indigenous voices. But we also cannot forget in the complexity, and as Terry Tiji, who's a member of the Takla Lake First Nation, states, take care of the land, and the land will take care of you. Now, how is the way we are currently learning, teaching, and even applying knowledges affected the progress of science itself in regards to things like climate change and sustainability? have we narrowed our use of previous knowledge, or more appropriately, have we marginalized certain knowledge systems based on an assumed scientific superiority? And I believe that we absolutely have, in this spirit of scientific hegemony that's really pervaded most branches of Western clinical practice, research, and inquiry. This idea of knowledge democracy has not really prevailed. And I noted previously, of course, that big term epistemological pluralism, which again recognizes and appreciates that in any given research or practice context, there may be several valuable ways of knowing, and that accommodating this plurality, this diversity, can lead to more successful integrative study and practice. Yet again, this has not been prioritized in many cases in our systems of learning, or even applications in the real world to complex problems. So before we can even think about addressing issues of equity in regard to any given topic, we must also even understand how ways of knowing, ways of being in the world, and ways of carrying out inquiry are also steeped in considerations of social justice and also the mere democracy of knowledge. And I also believe that in the spirit of westernized scientific hegemony that has again pervaded our knowledge systems, that we've actually forgotten how to be creative, often pushed into narrow boxes of thinking, narrow bases of reality, which have stifled our ability to really innovate in a truly profound way. But most importantly, how can we get ourselves out of this mess that we've created by continuing to destroy the planet, our only home? So for institutions to be able to start platforming places of belonging for Indigenous perspectives in planetary health, whether it's local, regional, or international levels, but also for campus communities to be able to implement planetary health principles in practice, they need to go from one way of knowing to ecologies of knowledge, hierarchical practices to communities of practice, disconnection to reconnection, fear to wonder and awe, universities to pluriversities, anthropocentric or human-centric to ecocentric, despair to hope, domination to participation, hegemony to inclusivity, me to we, knowledge transmission to relational care. And I also want to highlight the importance of being able to zoom in, zoom out, and zoom back again. This being able to work and think through the context of various scales is incredibly important to planetary health work, and if not given appropriate attention, can make real-world application difficult for those that have a hard time envisioning impacts at many levels. And in fact, many of our Indigenous ceremonies do this naturally, all the way from the micro-level experience to the cosmic level on a regular basis, merging in and out of these different dimensions and scales. And there's a lot to learn in that context of not only being in the experiential face with people, but bringing in context, bringing in relational care all the way up to the universal level, which again is common within Indigenous research methodologies and ways of being. Being able to envision this deep interconnectedness of our existence is probably one of the greatest gifts and abilities of Indigenous peoples in their knowledge systems, is noted through the understandings of ceremony, but also even looking at the depictions of our interconnectivities for all the way down from our venous systems or bronchial and aerial trees, all the way up to watersheds and river deltas, this beautiful interconnected nature of our humanities and our existence on this beautiful planet. Now, very, very recently, there was a group of Indigenous global scholars, practitioners, land and water defenders, respected elders, and knowledge holders who came together to define what we had then termed the determinants of planetary health from an Indigenous perspective. And we often, people may have heard about the social determinants of health, which are the non-medical factors that influence our health outcomes. And these could be, the conditions in which people are born, how they grow, where they work, where they live, their age, these wider sets of forces and systems that shape the conditions of daily life. And many of these things, people are familiar with, whether or not it's income and education, food insecurity, housing, those kinds of things. And of course, although these are incredibly important and not to be minimized, It was realized, however, that Mother Earth was being left out of the equation when it came to conversations around determinants of health. She was being left out of the equation as a living and breathing relative, how we often see her through Indigenous communities. So we wanted to, for once, place Mother Earth in the center and consider what are the determinants that make her well? What are the factors that will make an impact for her well-being? And I want to just highlight here a few of the determinants that I think are less well appreciated in wider climate and health circles and sustainability circles. And I won't go into detail on all of them, and we'll encourage you to see the paper online if you're interested. It's available open access at no charge. And the first kind of stems to the conversations from previously, which is this human interconnectedness within nature determinant. And we wrote very specifically that ecological demise or earth destruction points to an impaired human relationship with its inner self, because humans are nature and not apart from it. So in the broader sense, we have evidence in our society of the loss of an ecologically bound cultural identity, this earth-connected cultural identity. And this disconnect from nature manifests as a fragmented and dissociated identity that cannot recognize itself as a part of a system, which makes it much easier to project predatory and abusive impulses onto the environment. Thus, this ideology of independence has resulted in a sense of entitled ownership, a kind of perception of the natural world that relates to it through transactional relationships that do not have a sense of responsibility, care, or love. And this worldview will only continue to perpetuate planetary harm. Now, the other less appreciated determinant of planetary health that I want to highlight is that of Indigenous people's health. And we premise very strongly in our group's work that the health of the planet is intrinsically tied to the health and well-being of Indigenous peoples. Because when Indigenous peoples have their land, when Indigenous peoples have their culture, their sovereignty, they are more likely to have greater well-being. And when Indigenous peoples have greater well-being, they will continue to be able to sustainably care for more than a third of the remaining world's old-growth forests and 80% of the remaining biodiversity left on the planet. So it's imperative that Indigenous people's health is approached from a holistic lens that acknowledges cultural and land-based practices as being absolutely crucial for human health broadly, but also for the health of the planet. So we concluded our paper stating that Indigenous voices are a powerful and beneficial solutions-oriented force for Mother Earth's well-being and for all living beings that inhabit her. We therefore call for an inclusion of wisdom that is not mere knowledge or information, but is an insight that comes from the heart of Mother Earth. And I also want to highlight another thing that institutions can do. Recently, back in the spring of this year, the AFMC, Association of Faculties of Medicine of Canada, came out with an academic health institutions declaration on planetary health, which was a huge win for planetary health, at least within the Canadian medical environment, because we had the majority of the medical schools deans signing and committing their institutions to planetary health, which included a number of components of planetary health inclusion within education and research, transitioning to climate resilient and low carbon health systems in order to build healthy, sustainable, and just future for all. And University of Calgary, I'm happy to say, was one of the schools that signed on to that. And there's a large movement right now to work up the Academic Health Institute Declaration at a global level as we come forward to the next COP28 occurring in December. So because of that, there's a number of movements that are starting to occur within institutions and outside of institutions. But what's important, of course, is that we're not only signing on and talking about things, but actually having some accountability. But I want to just take a moment before I slowly start to wrap up here. Is this topic is not just a professional one for me, but a personal one. And as noted, I come from the Daninukwai First Nation up in Treaty 8 territory in the land of Denedeh, or land of the people, otherwise known as the Northwest Territories, where I was born and raised. And the Canadian subarctic and Arctic are warming at 3 to 4 times the global rate. So the changes within the climate have been happening for decades. And this summer was particularly hard, although we've had a number of climate events over the last number of years. Where I grew up just outside of Katlo-Deche First Nation and where my father lives, we've had 3 climate-related evacuations within the last 16 months. The first one was last spring, where we had a massive flood that actually flooded the part of the town that was supposed to be a flood zone, free zone. And then this past spring, we had a wildfire come through Katlo-Deche First Nation that burned down my dad's the band office building, as well as one of our precious cultural institutes that housed caches of local traditional Indigenous knowledges. So we were thankfully able to save about 40% thanks to police officers and firefighters that managed to throw a bunch of stuff in the back of the truck before the fire came. People's homes were burnt down. And then in the fall, the exact same community had another wildfire come from the other side of town. Led to a 5-week evacuation within the community. So these things are ongoing. The amount of adaptations that we have had to have within the Northwest Territories and in other places in the world that are facing these climate impacts directly, it is not just a matter of some future event. It is absolutely a reality and has been a reality for quite some time. So because of that, this takes a personal meaning, and there's something very deep and visceral when you go through traditional territories that you've been born and raised in, and there's nothing left. The berry bush is gone, the trap line's gone. We were thankfully very lucky that the fire came within about 6 feet of our family cabin that we grew up in for our cultural activities, and was somehow saved along those areas. But it's just a moment of reflection that, with all of these things, we're not just talking about statistics and symbolism. It really is the real life of many people living within this country, but also within many other countries around. So as we kind of move forward in bringing everything together, I really like to end with this quote from my dear sister's research on land-based healing in the Canadian North, where one of the elders shared, land-based is one of those words. It's a beautiful, wonderful term. It's bringing people back to the land and helping them become alive and remembering their humanity and their connection to all living things. We are the land. So if we remember who we are, then the same miracle that we see all around us will be us. Indigenous knowledges remind us how to walk in the world in a good way. And the path we hopefully decide to walk is together with Mother Earth as our relative, because you cannot understand true medicine power in whatever capacity that may be, unless you have an understanding of the nature of things. And to understand the nature of things, you need to be within nature. You need to connect to the animals, to the rocks, to the plants, the stars, and the wind. So with this, I want to say Masi Cho, thank you for your time and attention today. I really appreciate the opportunity to be with you all to talk about these topics. Of course, they're very deep and vast topics. So I hope this very brief introduction will at least stimulate some thought and consideration as you go forward with your own journeys. One thing I'll note is growing up, I always thought that Masi Cho was like a big thank you, because Cho is often added to many of our landscapes up north. So the Mackenzie River is De Cho, big river. Tu Cho is Great Slave Lake, big lake. But Elder Roy Fabian from Katlo-Deche First Nation taught me recently, actually, that Cho was actually added on as part of an honor. So it's not a big river, it's an honor river. It's not a big lake, it's an honor lake. So Masi Cho is not a big thank you, it's an honor thank you. So Masi Cho, welcome any questions, comments, or discussions at this time. And Clark, I'll turn it over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dr. Redvers. That was enlightening, as always. And lots of adulations, I think, coming through as well, with lots of hearts and claps. So that's great to see. Our forum here, folks, I have a couple of questions that I'll maybe kick off with Dr. Redvers, but if you're a participant here and you have a question you'd like to ask, there is a Q&A button in the bottom of Zoom. You're welcome to post your own question, or if somebody else asks a question very similar to yours, you're allowed to upvote it. You're allowed to sort of upvote it and it'll float to the top so that it catches my attention, and then we can address it. So I'll let you populate a few things in there. I mean, Dr. Redvers, you've answered some of my questions there, and I've always been interested in the idea that we humans are part of nature. We're not apart from it. And so you speak to that about the determinants of planetary health from an Indigenous perspective and the interconnectedness. I was going to ask, how do we create the conditions that enable us to, and I don't want to say overcome, but maybe to mesh or create that plurality in the dissonance between being in nature that surrounds us, and being in nature, the nature that embodies us. And so how do we reconcile that dissonance? And is it merely getting out there and connecting with the land and the waters? Are there other advice that you would give to people to reconcile a bit of that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a question that I get quite frequently. And one of the clear things that I've seen personally from experience, but also, in communicating with folks, is that the narratives matter. And sometimes it's just the framing of how we actually word. And the water river example is a perfect one. And, I love giving that example to young people, to kids and to teenagers and folks to think about, because we often don't see narratives that actually connect us with the water bodies around us on a physiological level. And people understand sometimes the science and the physiology more than the symbolisms and the metaphors. Mm-hmm. So trying to be able to find narratives, I still have this, desire. It's on my to-do list to write a children's book around this interconnectivity of, imagine the journey of a water molecule that's in your body right now from that lake. How many places that water molecule has been? Maybe it was floating over the Amazon, in that overland stuff. Maybe it was in a water body in an ocean on the other side of the world, and a conglomerate, all of those water molecules in us, 60% of those, the amount of wisdom that carries. So it's these kinds of narratives to portray and put right in front of us, those interconnectedness pieces that can't be denied, that people feel that somehow. They can resonate with that somehow. There's almost a reconnection that happens, but we need narratives that put those pieces together for people, because we are so disconnected. And being exposed to more of those interconnected nature, where it becomes part of our conversation that's understood. That's one of the easiest, most powerful things in my mind that I've found to be easy and effective. It's just bringing the pieces together for people first and foremost.
Yeah, definitely. And I love the thought of tracking the water molecule. In fact, I love your discussion at the beginning around, where are your waters from, and that makes up your body. I think about the bigger picture, and I frequently remind my children that the water they're drinking now may have been dinosaur or pee at some point in time, and way back when. So that, I don't know if that's a bit more meta view than just the local water bodies, but it's all connected and it just keeps coming back. Another thing that I'd love to ask, you've got a great quote out of the Determinants of Planet, or a few great quotes out of the whole paper is fantastic, the Determinants of Planetary Health paper. I wanted to ask, so I'm coming at this from a white settler, and I'd like to consider myself a settler ally. And so before I ask the question, the quote that I really like out of here is, irrespective of different geographies, we collectively dream that in the circle of time, our fellow global citizens will one day recognize Indigenous, natural, and first law, while actively acknowledging that our laws have standing and merit. Coexisting with common or crown law is an inclusive way to ensure that all global citizens can live in peace and harmony, while ensuring balance and care for our shared common home. And that's our only way forward. So how can we, or how can I, as a settler on these lands, actively support Indigenous nations' sovereignty and coexistence of these laws that are sometimes at competition, but there are parallel paths to be walked here? How do we do that?
Mm-hmm. Yep. It can be looked at it from many different scales and aspects, but I always tell folks that the best way to be an ally, in my mind, is to be able to amplify and bring forward already existing Indigenous voices, thought leaders, artists that are already working within the space and have dialogues, because a lot of us as Indigenous community members are not born with a lot of social capital. And oftentimes, we come from places where it's very difficult to get voices out there, particularly from youth and young people. And finding ways to be able to amplify those narratives, I think, is so incredibly impactful and important, not only for the capacity building, the confidence building of our youth and community members, but also there's brilliance in so many communities out there that just never gets to be shared. Those lessons, the ingenuities, the innovations, these narratives of interconnectedness can be really grounding for a world right now that is very lost and very disconnected and very troubled in many ways, of course, even given current events, because we don't know what we don't know. Mm-hmm. And if we're not starting to share these narratives and stories, okay, you could say, I'm going to support natural law, but without understanding the context and having some platform of the foundations, it's something without roots. It's just like a balloon floating. It's not tagged anywhere. So amplifying, bringing out, elevating existing Indigenous voices, particularly young people that are doing work in this area, is one of the best things in my mind that allies can do. Great, thank you. I'm going to switch to some of the Q&A here, because there's some great ones here. Aaron Woods asks, what are your thoughts on the buzzword of permaculture that's been coming up more in media, government, and larger corporate discussions? Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great question. There's an elder from El Salvador by the name of Juan, and he's one of the strong Indigenous voices within the space and often does teaching around it. And I will be honest that I come from the Canadian subarctic, so we don't grow a lot. We're mostly hunters and trappers. We do forage, of course, and have medicines, but permaculture and gardening is definitely something that is more for our southern relatives' experience and teachings as a part of our process. It's just very different ecosystems and environments. But what I can say is that listening to Juan, Elder Juan, and his Indigenous teachings around what permaculture actually is often very different from the narratives that I see within the mainstream discussions about permaculture that often seems to be trying to embody Indigenous perspectives and ways of knowing, but sometimes gets a little disconnected from that. And one of the best examples that I love to hear from Juan is that the originators of permafrost are two white people from Australia. They're known as the originators of the field and the movement of permaculture in many of the papers and discussions, when actual fact, it's based on many, traditional ecological knowledge practices from around the world. So how that dynamic kind of plays is very interesting. But from an experiential component, I can't say I'm an expert on permaculture because I am a snow girl. Yeah, fair enough, for sure. But also speaks to the loss of Indigenous ways of being with the climate change up north and the rest of it, like or changes. It's a sad thing to think that the growing season up north might actually be extended, which is not exactly what we are targeting or looking for. Sonia Jakubek asks us, hi Sonia. She asks us if you can discuss the place of grief and mourning, thinking of Lertzman and Consolo and others who have found value in actively mourning that loss and extinction. And I'm what's going on in the world, the loss of biodiversity and species and things like that. What is, but also in terms of grief and mourning in the human condition. Sonia is wondering what is supportive and what might not be. Mm-hmm. It's a great question. And, it brings, of course, just for those that may not be aware, kind of two terms, eco-anxiety and ecological grief. So Ashley Consuelos, of course, doing a lot of work with Innu populations in the eastern part of Canada around this concept of ecological grief. And I'll share a story. I got an interesting question from an Italian reporter last year, I think, who asked me point blank, is eco-anxiety a privilege? And, it was a great question because, it triggered some reflection on, if you're privileged enough to be in a state where you can experience some anxiety, meaning that you're not running around with 3 or 4 jobs, trying to get food, experiencing war, all of these other kinds of things. The ecological anxiety piece may be something that isn't more often experienced in high income countries, for example, and not necessarily in low income places or marginalized communities. And I had to think about that. And I thought back to my own community and what I've seen from elders, from community members, and otherwise. And from my experience, I have seen most often in Indigenous communities, particularly from elders and others, more of an ecological grief picture comparatively to an outright anxiety. It doesn't mean that it's not there, but from speaking to elders and leaders and community members, there's more of a grief picture. There's a worry, but the grief is there. And, I wonder about that, because if you see Earth as a relative, if you see Earth as your mother, if you see the plants and the ecosystems as a relative and she's been harmed, that's more of a grief. There's a sadness. There's something in there, a hurt that occurs comparatively to an anxious sort of picture. At least that's what I've seen in communities. I have no data to back this up, but it's just something that I've seen. But then the grief is often layered on so many already established things like colonialism, residential schools. This is just another layer of grief of something that's being taken away from communities. So I think there's a lot of complexity in that system that oftentimes we don't think about the nuance and perhaps the context. No right or wrong answer, of course. But the point of me sharing that is, I think, depending on the state of the community, whether or not it is more of an eco-anxiety sort of presentation, which I do see in a lot of young people today, non-Indigenous young people, as well, and in these climate movements, comparatively to a grief picture, I think there's very different responses to that, and very different potential coping mechanisms, and also potential different solutions depending on kind of the state or the nature of the collective response to these occurrences. And I'll ask some of the youth, and I've been in forums sometimes at international levels where I'll see these young climate activists, which are doing amazing things, and they're doing all of these things, and then they're sitting there for most of the time on their phones, like many young people these days. And I ask them sometimes, I said, when's the last time you went out in a park or went for a walk? And I worry that the young climate movements are driven so much by fear instead of by love and connection to the land. That how does that set up people for these anxious states, but also doesn't give them a root or a connection to what it is that we're actually trying to do as a part of movement. How does your solutions differ if you react out of fear comparatively if you react out of love and care for something? And I think those are two different things, and I don't think we talk about that enough in terms of the kinds of supports that may be necessary for these young people that are experiencing these dimensions. So that was a long-winded answer, but it is contextual, and it brings up a lot of questions, I think.
It does, even, and I like the segue to the Italian reporter's question as well. But if I reflect on some of the eco-anxiety that I've seen, and you just talking about it coming, that eco-anxiety is coming because of the fear, as opposed to talking about it from a place of potential love and connection and understanding the stewardship. I love that perspective. Thank you. And it's given me some food for thought too. We've done some local work here on nature prescriptions and getting outdoors and doing something with people you care about in the great outdoors and in nature. And people sometimes look at me like, really? Like that's a thing? And the answer is, well, why not? Like you said, when's the last time you did it? Another question here is from Jack Goodwin. What are some other ways we can practice or think about epistemological pluralism? I think he just wanted me to practice the pronunciation.
It's a mouthful, I know. I mean, there's been different conceptualizations, of course. I'm sure people are familiar with the elder Albert Marshall, Mi'kmaq elder in Two-Eyed Seeing, which is, essentially an embodiment of epistemological pluralism, using one eye from the Indigenous ways of knowing and being, and the other eye from Western ways, and looking at things through the gift of multiple perspectives. So, Elder Albert Marshall has essentially framed this in a way, and from what I've heard from Elder Albert, from my understanding, is that the two-eyed seeing is sort of the modern day English interpretation of it, but it was based on this idea that you need multiple perspectives in many situations to be able to better understand what the true reality is, so that you're able to make decisions with a really holistic understanding of whatever situation that you're coming to. So whether it's two-eyed seeing or epistemological pluralism, there's multiple ways of knowing in other communities that have these teachings around how we do this. And Indigenous communities have often done this, and multiple perspectives came from the recognition of all of the various Indigenous nations, because of course, we interacted from many different communities depending on where we were in this land base, that my teachings, my protocols, my creation stories, everything are very different from Cree, very different from, Lakota or Dakota. And being able to be respectful of these different perspectives was important for overall peace, harmony, and survival of Indigenous nations to be able to come together. So that style of collective being, of consensus decision-making, there's all of these kinds of things that are coming from our Indigenous traditions that can be looked to embody aspects of how we actually work in ways that are, in the modern context, transdisciplinary, right? So that could be another way of seeing this. I think epistemological pluralism is a little bit deeper, because it's about, where does your knowledge come from? Where does your knowledge come from? Because it might be different from where my knowledge comes from. And using these tools and strategies that we've had for thousands of years to be able to sit respectfully with others and come to a place where we can actually deeply listen and acknowledge and come to shared values or solutions based on the crises that we face.
Definitely. And I feel like sometimes it's a bit tricky when there's an urgency to the crisis, and it's lots of folks haven't yet taken the time to maybe reflect on what some of those deeper values are in that cultural context, and remember where you've come from. So thank you for that. Ali Zaidi asks a good question around how do we find the right balance for the sustainable development while keeping the current highly technological and advanced living standards. There's a dichotomy there that's at odds.
Yep, it is at odds. And, we have to be honest that it is at odds, I think, with that. And that's part of the discussion. I was at a gathering at the Wellcome Trust in the UK, and this gentleman, was standing up at every single session and asking the exact same question. How can we reconcile the fact that to keep our technological sort of lifestyle that we have right now, we have to mine lithium from mostly Indigenous lands around the globe to be able to sustain ourselves. So basically we're continuing a new extraction, a new harm in a different way, looking at different materials and minerals that still are mined from the land. Fossil fuels, yes, global greenhouse gas emissions, but lithium is still a destruction of this process that really we're just replacing one extraction with another extraction to keep up what we see as a so-called modern life. And it's a complexity, I think, that really hasn't been discussed enough out there. I was at a talk at Stanford in their new sustainability school, and somebody had asked me the question because they're seriously considering how to be able to colonize another planet. That's a real research agenda at Stanford right now. And they asked me what I thought about it. And I said, well, I have some strong opinions about colonization to start the conversation. But, it's sort of this desire of how do we keep what we have? And it's such an interesting state to be in. Like, I need this, I need that, I need the. Humans are so funny when you think about it. We're destroying ourselves by thinking that way of living is the way that we need to be living, and that it actually makes us happy, when there's absolutely no evidence to show that the technologically high lifestyle we had makes us happy. In fact, most of the studies shows that it makes us unhappy, more anxious, and depressed. So there's some fundamental questions there that really need to be asked as a society that I don't think we discuss enough about.
And that doesn't even get into the disconnect that things like social media and the friends that you've got there on your friend list that are not real friends and all the rest of it. So that's brilliant. Yeah, there's, how do we have bigger discussions around accepting the fact that what we're doing is maybe not right and we've got to go back to a different way. I'm not sure who would entertain a discussion like that. There'd be a lot of pushback, but I also saw a lot of love on here. So maybe we're talking to the choir here.
Well, the funny thing is, from our community's sake, and we've seen that with the wildfires up north, is at some point with our natural laws, it doesn't matter. You're going to be forced to consider that question.
Absolutely. And when it comes to supply chain and all the rest of it, right? Yep. Yeah. It's just, you can't get it. And it's no longer just a first world problem. It's a global issue. Brian Nichols asks or starts with, my lived experience is Buddhist practice based on the interconnectedness of all that arises in our world system. What seems missing in our education initiatives, raising awareness, shifting consciousness, and so on, is that the body and the need for somatic cultivation of the knowledge and connection to the land. Cognitive awareness only goes so far. Somatic awareness is necessary. So what are your thoughts on how to do that with students and others? How do we broaden land-based learning? And can you speak to successes in this approach to transformative education?
Yeah, so there's a few great examples. One of the few Bush universities is Decinta University, which is based actually just out of Yellowknife in the Northwest Territories. It's one of the few land-based programs that allows university credit on the land for institutions. And they have had a long history, 10, 15 years now of offering land-based educational opportunities for students, mostly in undergrad, but I think they do some graduate-based courses as well. So I would say looking to them as a model for the reintegration of land-based learning and approaches would be one. The other one is actually Blue Quills University, which is south of Edmonton, and they have a very beautiful long Indigenous name that I can never pronounce properly, so I'm using the English way of Blue Quills. And they're one of the few Indigenous-run, Indigenous-owned universities that actually offer a PhD program. A lot of people don't know about them, but their land-based approach, reintegration of educational experience for primarily Indigenous students is just, again, a beautiful model of what's possible in institutional settings for reconnecting some of these narratives. And the last thing I'll note on that, and it's sort of the differentiation between, having a conscious experience and an unconscious experience. And one of the examples that I often give, and maybe going back to your nature prescription option, is if you walk in a forest right now, if you walk in the forest, even if you have a plant in your office, but more potently, if you go for a walk in the forest, we know very clearly from the research that all of a sudden your white blood cells start to increase, your natural killer cells start to increase. All of these immune system components happen unconsciously. You don't have to think about that happening. It just happens naturally in your body. There's a deep interconnectedness to nature where we receive physiological signals from being out in these natural places. We know having plants, within a recovery room reduces surgical recovery time in hospital beds, all of these there. But imagine now if you make that a conscious experience at the same time. So now you have the unconscious physiological response plus the conscious interconnectivity response to that environment. How much benefit we see from those kinds of experiences. So there is value in not even thinking about those interconnectedness, just being in nature gives you that. But bringing them together, I think, can be a very powerful way of moving things forward.
Yeah, you're sort of speaking to some intentionality with it. Yeah, great. Thank you. And thank you for those resources. Norma Jeremixa Grezel says, Mazicho Nicole, Nayati Netzi. I'm probably not saying that correctly, so I feel like that was maybe just a salutation. Mike Gemery asks, how can Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people share the best of their knowledge effectively, especially with respect to species that are commonly called invasive, but might be better called locally destructive? And that's a good one, because I will sometimes joke that I am kind of an invasive species. And so, yeah, that's a good one. How do you reconcile that?
I'll turn, there's a few recent actually papers by some Indigenous scholars on invasive species that I think were done very beautifully. I'll see if I can dig up, but I'm sure if somebody typed in Indigenous invasive species, Indigenous scholars or something, it should pop up. And it was a beautiful delve into this concept, because many Indigenous communities see plant relatives as plant relatives. And often, this dichotomy of not wanting to label something as being disruptive, that, is there a purpose for it being here? Why are you visiting our lands? What is the relationship now that we need to see? So it's a very different viewpoint on this idea of invasive species, and probably one of the few papers that I've seen from Indigenous scholars that are really exploring some of this dichotomy and what this means. And, thinking about up north, because we've seen a lot of migration of plant species and even animals that we never used to see before, even when I was young. And, I brought this plant once to an elder that I saw at my cabin. We had a cabin upside of Yellowknife, and I'd never seen this plant before in my life. I didn't know what it was. The flowers looked weird. And I, offered some tobacco, and I picked it, and I brought it to this elder. And I said, I've never seen this plant before. Do you know what it is? And she looked at it, she said, no, I've never seen that plant before, but leave it with me for a bit. I want to be with it. I'm going to taste it. I'm going to be with it, and I'll let you know. So, what that sort of showcase was that it wasn't like, you're not supposed to be here. It was sort of an invitation to be with that plant and really to get to know it a little bit, to find out a little bit more about why it might be here. What's the effect? So it just goes to show the difference of how we kind of approach these things sometimes. And therefore, the dialogues sometimes need to be more open, flexible, and iterative to allow those kinds of experiences with things like so-called invasive species to really be shared in a way that some of those teachings may be able to come out. Because if you label the dialogue as invasive right up, then it changes the dynamic, right?
Completely, because it's a negative term, right? And I love that idea of it's an invitation, or it has a purpose to being there, because often those species do really well in the ecosystem that they have entered, and there's got to be a reason for it. Just like the same reason why people don't like dandelions. Their whole purpose is to break compacted ground apart and allow better infiltration of water again. It has a reason for being.
And sometimes the reason, we've had a lot of problem with beavers up north, like going up in the Arctic. They're now creating dams around the Arctic Ocean that never used to be there. So it's affecting the fishing of many local communities. So, again, the question, why is the beaver here? It's not necessarily getting upset at the beaver, even though it's causing lots of problems up there. And they don't really want beavers there because it's affecting their fishing. But what is the cause? So, again, it's trying to figure out the dynamic, the systems approach to why this beaver is here to help solve that problem so the beaver can go home.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. If only we could ask them. Yeah. Danielle, we'll do a couple more questions here before we wrap up. Danielle Korsrud asks, how can physicians bridge together Indigenous medicine and Western medicine in their practice, given that structural changes to our healthcare system and policies can take time?
Mm-hmm. This is it's a little bit of a delicate question, because, there's a lot of sensitivities around non-Indigenous physicians using or embodying Indigenous therapies or approaches as a part of their care, comparatively to respecting, honoring, working with shared decision-making with patients to ensure that their choices are elevated and the work with their home traditional healers are done in a collaborative way. Those are two very different kinds of things. And there may be a little bit of protocol issues depending on the community for a non-Indigenous person, unless they've been ceremonied in, invited, went through their own protocols, and allowed by the community to actually use those medicines. It's a little bit delicate, and I would say in many cases it may or may not be appropriate in that case. However, embodying cultural safety operationalized through shared decision-making to ensure that a patient's choice of utilizing traditional Indigenous medicine is respected and honored and worked with is very much a skill that I think all physicians should have within this country.
Great, thank you. Yeah. Yeah, it's complicated, to say the least. And I just want to point out before I ask the next question that Rochelle has linked in the chat there to the Indigenous Climate Hub, a link to Indigenous perspectives to understanding invasive species. And so there's, I think there's maybe that's one of the papers and one of the narratives that you were referencing. Nikki Ballantyne asks or says, first of all, Tansy Nicole, how can we explain epistemological pluralism to a younger group of youth that would really engage them on planetary health?
Well, one teaching that was given to me by actually one of my PhD students, Jake Taylor, who was taught by an Anishinaabe elder, basically told him that, if you have a cup, so this is a cup, there's a handle on one side and there's a smooth side on the other one. And if somebody's never seen this cup or a cup before in their entire life, and you put the cup down on the table, you have somebody sitting on one side of the cup and somebody sitting on the other side of the cup, and they're both looking at the cup, one from the handle side, one from the other side. Again, they've never seen a cup before. Of course, the person on this side would describe what they see, which, this thing sticking out, probably the smooth area. And then the person sitting on this side would describe again what they see on this side of the cup. So they're both looking at the same thing, but they're describing it differently. Who's right?
Great.
And the teaching for that, of course, is that you need the gift of multiple perspectives to be able to understand the true reality of the whole. Because if you only see things from one side, you're only going to be able to appreciate the side that you see.
We're all talking about the same thing. Yeah, great. And then maybe one of our last questions here is from Ruth. How do we nudge and move our government systems from an administration perspective to address planetary health?
Yep. So there's different levels of government right now. I will share one initiative that I think would be good for folks to support on. Is Canada is one of the few countries, G7 countries in particular, that doesn't actually have an environmental health institute as part of the research enterprise. So Canadian Institute for Health Research has zero coverage of environmental, planetary health, climate change, anything. And our relatives down south, of course, with the NIH, have spent millions and millions and millions of dollars, over the last 20 to 30 years. So that is a huge deficit in my mind in terms of the ability to start to better understand the impacts of coming climate change. So there are a number of activities right now to try to lobby the federal government to ensure that there is more coverage of environmental health components within research. But also, of course, the political landscape is very complicated right now on many levels. And I lived and worked in North Dakota for about 4 to 5 years, which of course is very conservative oil state as well. And one of the things that I learned being in that environment, because, I know it can be also different province to province and territory to territory, is being able to figure out narratives that are important for people in the communities. And one thing I realized down there was that one of the most land connected people in North Dakota were farmers, because of course they know their lands, they know their animals better than anybody. And trying to avoid some of the complex meta level politics and terminologies and really focusing on the ground levels where people just care about putting food on their plate, paying their bills, and trying to figure out these narratives that work with the context of the things that they do. So farmers, whether it's cattle drivers or otherwise, having real conversations about the issues that they were facing oftentimes leads to better and open conversations about where things need to be made and changed in communities. We have a lot of potential for activism in good, positive ways, but I think we do it sometimes too much in a doom and gloom way instead of on a hope and informing way. And having more positive narratives of coming together, I think, is really needed in our society today. And I see you starting to put those pieces together, but it's complex. It's complex.
Well, and on that note, I think when you reference youth, that really is the definition of sustainability, is it not? It's looking multiple generations ahead for those to come, and with the hope that maybe someday you'll be considered a good ancestor. So on that note, do you have any closing words you'd like to share?
I don't think so. Just thanks to everyone for time and attention today. I know there's a lot of community priorities out in the world, and appreciate being able to spend a short amount of time with you today.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate your insights, and I'm going to rewatch your presentation again and again. Thank you very much, Dr. Redvers. And I'll pass it. I'll pass it back to Alana Dawn for some closing comments.
Yeah, I just want to say a heartfelt thank you to Nicole. I really appreciate you spending your time with us and sharing your knowledge and expertise. I took tons of notes myself, and just wrote down again that last comment on, transformative change really being rooted in love and viewing the earth as a relative. So I'm going to be reflecting how I can integrate that more in my day instead of maybe being more anxious about it. But there's way more I took away from your presentation as well, and I'm going to be listening to the recording again. But again, I just wanted to say a huge thank you, and a huge thank you to you, Clark. So with that, I do have a couple other announcements to share with everyone. And before I do that, I'm just going to pop into the chat those links for the schedules for Calgary Climate Symposium. We got Sustainability Week and Climate Conversations. So everyone could see that in the chat. And as I mentioned, we're also celebrating today the kickoff of we just launched the U Calgary Institutional Sustainability Report. Just gonna make sure you can see the right screen. So we'd really love to celebrate the amazing work that everyone has been doing all across campus to advance sustainability. Sorry, you're gonna have to watch me click through this. I'll be trying to, there we go, okay. Thanks for your patience, everyone. We're really excited to share this video where we can really celebrate all the amazing work people have been doing all year long to advance sustainability at U Calgary. Thanks so much, everyone. I do have one more slide. I'm trying to advance right now, but it's not working. So I'm just gonna stop sharing screen. And I really loved everyone's engagement throughout today's session. I loved seeing all the hearts and the claps. So bear with me one more moment. We actually have a survey that we'd really love for people to participate. Because sorry. Here, you can see the survey here with QR codes. I'll just leave it as is right here. But we would love to get your feedback to hear about what next steps we can take for advancing sustainability and climate change at U Calgary. So there's a QR code if you're able to scan it. I will also follow up with everyone and send this in an email along with the video. And we'd also just love to thank you for being here today. And in addition, thank Environment Climate Change Canada who sponsored this event. Just a great big thank you to all of you for all the work that you're doing, and thank you for being here today. Take care, everyone.
Bye. Have a good day.